Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Cheaper Than Therapy. So we're going to do a Q&A today. But we're going to combine a couple as we do because we feel like some of the topics are similar-ish,
Mm.
and kind of structure it into more of a topic-led conversation than an actual Q&A. Does that make sense what I just said?
Makes
Um,
sense to me.
okay, good.
I
I
don't know
guess
if
in this
everybody
moment that's
else
all that matters
can't
since you're
speak
the one
for
I'm
the
talking
world,
to.
but I'm tracking. So,
So, one person was asking a question about boundaries, and they were talking about how because they have such a fear of abandonment, they have a really hard time setting boundaries and tolerating when people don't have a good response to their boundaries. And the other person was talking about, and also the important part of that, because I want to speak to this and what we talk about our conversation, is that people seem to be having a lot of negative responses to this person's boundaries. I
okay.
think that's important to say because I think there's a point
Mhm.
in there that you and I want to talk
Okay.
about.
Okay.
And then the other question was around somebody who recently went through a divorce and is feeling like they don't even know their ex at all. And
Mm.
essentially, in the question, they said, is it normal for somebody to just completely turn into a stranger?
Mm.
I don't even recognize them. Did they just put on a performance for 10 years? Like, who was this person? Right. And so, seemingly on the surface, those two don't seem like they would go together, but we are feeling like they do.
Yes.
You want to kick that off?
Sure. Yeah, I think because of the way that the two of us tend to frame the things that we do relationally to maintain attachments. Those two things are really related to one another in that they sort of speak to our abandonment wounds. And, I'm going to just jump into the question about the woman who was married and asking if that person was playing a part for all of those years. And to that, I would say, perhaps, right?
Hmm.
Like, I do think that there are a lot of ways that we can really minimize our true selves and wear a mask of identity, basically not like consciously or certainly not like,
Like
as an attempt
maliciously.
to maliciously, yeah, like harm someone, but because so much of that has been ingrained within us as a survival mechanism in our family of origin or in our early childhood experiences, wherever. But a lot of times that's, I don't feel like it's safe for people to see me, and then something comes up, like a point in my life, a catalyst for a shift, and that's not sustainable to my psyche anymore. And so there's like the parts of me that were attempting to do that, I sort of have to disassociate from those parts for a while. And sometimes that includes a relationship with another person. And it can feel really painful because it feels like an enormous abandonment to that person that I've sort of like split off from the parts of myself that were alive in order to maintain that attachment. Do you know what I mean?
I feel like I've experienced this personally, but I've also had clients that have spoken to something similar. And this idea of people evolving and growing and changing too. I think a little bit I got what you're saying. I think there's that in there too, right? Which is like I might not be the same person that I was 10 years ago either. And also, that's not necessarily about you. I do think that we tend to personalize people changing so much that it can almost be like incapacitating. Like
Mm.
this thing that we do, which is personalized, the way people behave, the way people act, the way people show up or don't show up.
Mhm.
um Even, I don't know why this just popped into my mind, but that whole trend that's kind of been going on social media where people will say, if they wanted to, they would.
Mhm.
It feels even similar to that. It's like we personalize so much of the way people show up. Like it's about you. If they loved you, they would do this thing. If they loved you, they would act this way. And I think so much of our work around like establishing a sense of self, capital S, is really depersonalizing the behavior of other people. And also like why getting, I guess, in this specific question, really sitting with this idea of like, what about it is bothering me so much that this person is showing up differently now than when we were in relationship together. Like we're not in relationship anymore. So what about that is something that I'm obsessing about? What about that is kind of, yeah, getting me activated so much? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got stuck on the if they wanted to, they would, because I
Mm,
have seen so much of that, and I think you're right. And here's what, like, a lot of people aren't going to agree with me, but I kind of agree with that statement.
Mm.
And I would say if it were aligned with you, they would, right?
Well,
Because
that's more what I agree with.
to
Yes.
my point, or to your point, excuse me, I think there's a lot of internalizing
Yeah.
someone not wanting to as
Yeah.
meaning that I am not worthy of that thing. I think our healing work is around understanding they don't want to because that's where they are, either
Mhm.
energetically or developmentally or with whatever's going on with them. And that has absolutely not a damn thing to do with you.
Yep.
That's my work, right? Like, that's my work to look at like why I am making that mean something about me and my worthiness that it
Mhm.
doesn't mean. Because I've heard a ton of people
Mhm.
sort of respond to those posts saying that's just not true. I'm like, I do think it's true, but I don't think it has anything to do with you at all. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the personalizing part I think is the biggest component. I mean, I do struggle a little bit with the word want because I do think that even in that word, there's still a personalizing using the word want. Like somebody might not have the capacity to. And that doesn't actually mean that they don't want to. It means that wherever they're at in their life right now, they might not have the capacity to do the thing that you wish they would do or you want them to do to make you feel loved or shown up for or whatever, right? I mean, listen, we could go extreme with this and say, like, if they wanted to, I don't know, stop abusing me, they would. And I would argue, maybe, but also it might be a capacity thing. I would say, flip it around and say, if they don't have the capacity to show up in the way that I wish they would show up for my sake, then I need to be the owner of the relationship and say, like, what am I going to do about it? Right. And so, I mean, obviously, and I say that with a grain of salt, taking into account all of the things about being in an abusive relationship, obviously, and the struggles to get out. But I'm just using that as an extreme example of why that statement I think can just be problematic when it's like just so black and white, right? It doesn't take, well, that's just social media, pop psychology in general, no nuance. But I think it could be an issue. I just don't think we're at the place yet societally where we're really like take personal responsibility, as you and I talk about a lot.
Yeah, I think and now we're just like,
I know.
like in the I don't know, the vortex of this the wording because I think words matter. And I think that so often my struggle is I think conceivably if they wanted to, they would get support. They would like do whatever they needed to. Like I think someone wanting to, we really need to like unpair with my worthiness.
Mhm.
Period. Like I do think that people change in their lives when they decide to, and I have never met someone really where that is based on, like, someone else's worthiness of them changing. Do you know what
Right.
I mean? Like,
Yep.
certainly I can love someone, but to your point, that doesn't mean that I have the capacity at this point in my development to
Mhm.
do whatever the thing is, even if I want to, right? So that's
Right.
what I hear in what you're saying. But also, I think our work is to say, it's just not aligned. And that
Mhm.
actually really doesn't have anything to do with that person and where they
Mhm.
are. And I need to stop focusing so much on like where they are in their process because that
Yep.
is so much of what we do is we like, oh, let me like dissect why this person is like
Yep.
what their motivation is. And to me ultimately it doesn't matter, it's
Doesn't
just not
matter.
aligned with me and what I desire in a partnership at this point, right?
Yeah, it's I was thinking about going back to the specific thing around like the person saying, "Oh, we got a divorce," and they're a completely different person. I was thinking one time I heard Dan Savage on a podcast and he was talking about how often he has people that will come to him um talking about infidelity as this
Mm,
example that he was giving and he was saying
mhm.
the numerous times he's had somebody come to him who have been, let's say, together for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and they'll find out about an infidelity and they'll be like, that's it. It was all a lie.
Yep.
Everything leading up to this moment was a lie. And he's like, why is that? Like, why does this thing erase 10 years of somebody being or showing up a certain way? Right. And I think there's even a similarity in that conversation. It's like, why do we need things to look the way that we need them to look? Period. Hard stop. No room for, again, nuance, no room for the gray area in order for us to feel okay and us to feel, um, safe and all those things. Um, I think it's really important for us to question our rigidity around this stuff.
Yeah, to me, a lot of this, and I have the same thought often. A lot of times when I'm working with couples and they're attempting to repair after that type of rupture, and that
Mhm.
is like the most common sentiment. Like, I
Mhm.
feel like now everything that we've ever experienced
Was a
was a
lie.
lie
Yep.
and isn't real. And to me, that is just such an it's the tricky thing with what we're conditioned to believe is true
Mhm.
about love, and that when you find the one, I was just writing about this yesterday, this person becomes like this omnipresent, all knowing, infallible, like
God
figure. Like
figure.
we make them like our higher power, and that,
Mhm.
like, of course, their pain points and their fears and their overwhelm are not going to come into play. They're the one, they're going to be the perfect parent that I've been longing to experience for a lifetime. And of course, that's not true.
Oh,
Of course, the person that I'm in relationship with is just as human as I am. But, this is why I'm always like, I feel like our relationship structures need to evolve less so much about like, when I think about the way that we've been holding monogamy, it's less about like we need to do away with monogamy. Like, I don't care. I'm just more concerned with the way that I feel like our relationships are stunting our personal growth, and that we
mhm.
are attempting to make another person responsible for holding our existential angst and for me not continuing to develop and doing the hard things of life, like facing like the existential fears that we're attempting not to face by making this person my God who's never going to let me down and always only want to think of and choose me and be with me. And, I think that those things can be true even when someone is going through their own things that make
That's
them
right.
feel really challenged to like stay present and focused on you. That is what a parent does for a child, and it's not your parent. Do you know what I mean?
I do, and
I
that
say, do you know what I mean?
I mean, I also say, does
Realizing.
that make sense a lot? So I think today we might be doing that thing that women do, which
Is
is
that
actually
that thing that women do? Are we
apologizing.
doing it to each other
We
right
are
now?
actually asking, do I make sense when I do make sense?
Yes. Are you tracking
Um,
me, V?
shit. Yeah, I think that I think all this is circling around exactly what we were saying about depersonalizing, right? It's like it's got to mean something about me. And so to go back to the question that someone asked, I think um sure, I mean, let's validate that it feels like a sting and it's a challenge to the
Mm,
structure in which you've held your relationship, the view of this person, the view of what this person meant to you, and all of these things. And can we sit with the why around why I feel like it's a personal attack on me,
mm,
or why I feel like it means something about me as a person that this person is not showing up in the structure in which I've held them up to this point, right? And is there a way that I can soften into letting go of some of those structures that I've held this person within? And honestly, what I would say is the more ability I have to let go of that structure that I've seen myself in, the more
mm.
ability I'll have to let go of somebody else's like kind of structure or box that I've placed them in, right? Because you and I both know this. Like, I'm only able to give to others what I'm able to give to myself, right? Or I'm only able to hold or see others in the same light that I'm able to see myself. So, again, coming back to self, because that's what Danae and I are going to say all the time, where am I not allowing myself to be different, to not be in a box, to
Mm.
act entirely different now than I would have 10 years ago, or to think entirely different now than I did 10 years ago? Um, and maybe doing some of that self inquiry and sitting with that reality will open up some space for this other person to show up differently and have it not mean anything about you.
God, I think what you just said is so potent, because I think there's a way that we are learning to really give other people the dignity of their life experience, meaning all of us are meant to continue to change and
Hmm.
evolve. And we've just lived within structures that say, once you get married to someone, this is your person. They
Yep.
belong to you. You like know that they will be who they are. And it's just been so stifling, I
Hmm.
believe, developmentally to all of us. I think, if you're with the same person, this is something my mentor says, you're going to be with 4 to 5 people within the context of one relationship.
Yep.
If you are, doing all of the things and continuing to challenge yourself to grow, that's healthy. That's like what we desire to
Yep.
have in our human experience. But I think it can feel deeply threatening to the part of us that's really challenged by sitting in the uncertainty of the unknown spaces, right? And so my work becomes to do exactly what Vanessa just said, which is like, can I really attempt to identify within me where I am not giving myself space to change and evolve and maybe step outside of my comfort zones into who I have the potential to be, because I don't think it would be as activating to you for this person to change in a way that feels so radical if you were also on the path of really having these big shifts happening within you. Um, you would want space for that. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm. Mm.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You know what I mean?
It's like a tick.
You know what my tick is? I say "right" a lot, which I'm sure anybody listening to the podcast knows. That's my tick. Instead of saying "like," which I'm sure I say also, I say "right, right, right, right." I'm not really asking you though, right? Question mark. It's really more like a "right" with a period, which is even more irritating. So
The
we all have
ticks make I used to say beautiful when I was teaching yoga all the time, and it was like a tick, and I'd be like, "Stop it today."
one of
And,
those ticks in yoga that drive me nuts is that term "juicy." I used to hear that all the
oh,
time in
I don't
yoga
say
classes.
juicy.
Oh, like juicy hip opener, and I'm like, please don't use the word juicy. I don't like this.
I don't think I ever said
A
juicy
lot of
in
yoga teachers use
12
juicy.
plus years teaching. Wow. That's funny.
That's funny. Well, let's talk about the boundary question because I think what you and I thought this was a similar kind of conversation.
That sounds
Um,
juicy.
this sounds like a juicy conversation. Um, so bad. So I guess what I want to first start with around the boundary conversation is let's pull it back and talk about
Mhm.
what boundaries are. Because I think that I hear a lot of confusion, even in my day to day practice with clients, but also out there in the world of social
Mhm.
media on what boundaries are, right? And based on the fact that this question was written, like a lot of people are having a hard or a strong response or a negative response to my boundaries. I would want to know, are those boundaries? Like what are
Mm.
those things that you think you're setting, right? Because I think that for a lot of us, especially if we grew up, which it sounds like this person did because they gave a little bit of background context, in a home where they didn't really have a voice,
Mhm.
we didn't really grow up learning how to set boundaries, right? Boundaries are learned. You're not just born knowing how to set boundaries. And so, in the beginning of learning how to set boundaries, a lot of times what we start doing is we start throwing up a lot of walls and we start, shoving rules in people's faces and attempting to use what we're calling boundaries, but actually are just kind of ways that we're trying to control the other person, right? And how they act and show up. And so I want to normalize that because if you've never done it before and you're out there stumbling around, you're going to probably not do it right. Right.
Mhm.
But I want to call out the fact that we might need to adjust the way that we're showing up, not expect other people to adjust how they're showing up in response to our air quote boundaries. I was going
Yeah.
to say, does that make sense? There's my tick.
Yeah. And I think if it's an actual boundary and it's held with like grace and reverence for the other person and their journey, most people aren't even going to be aware that you're setting boundaries, to be
That's
honest.
right.
Like,
That's right.
I feel like a lot of times people feel like boundaries need to be this big articulated
Yes.
like pronunciation of like, here's what's changing in
Here's
our
my
day.
boundary.
I set a ton of boundaries that people would be completely unaware have been set between us, because boundaries are about me and my relationship with the world and what I am going to do
Yes.
or not do. So yeah, I don't know
That's
why
so
people are
important.
upset with your boundaries unless you're making a proclamation.
But I
Um,
do think that that's what we're taught. I think that the social media world around boundaries teaches us that boundaries are proclamations and they're really not. Boundaries are more
yeah.
about how are you going to change your behavior and how you show up in response to somebody else, right? So like let's give an example. Like um I have a boundary around, I don't know, I'm making this up, but it's kind of pulling from a friend of ours, somebody who is like perpetually late, right?
Mm.
We have a particular friend who typically shows up 20 to 45 minutes late for everything. And it used to really irritate me, right? And what somebody might think a boundary is me saying to her, if you're not able to show up on time, I'm not going to meet you for dinner anymore.
That's a rule.
That's a
So we're
rule.
clear.
That's not a boundary. I think that's super important. And I think it's a really confusing thing for most people. The boundary actually for me, for myself, now I might have a conversation with her if it comes up and I feel like it's worth having that conversation where I just feel, I don't know, unappreciated or I feel like you don't care, whatever. We can have that kind of conversation. But really, the boundary is I need to decide if I want to have dinner with this person anymore or not. period. And if I do, then how am I going to adjust my behavior and how I show up?
Mm,
That's why I think it's so beautiful what you said about half the time people don't even know I'm setting a boundary, because it doesn't always have to be a proclamation.
yeah.
It can be like, okay, I'm going to shift myself in this way. We don't need to talk about it. Maybe we do, but maybe we don't, you know?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of, to your point, the way that boundaries are spoken about in the world of social media and in sort of pop psychology, they just become further perpetuations of codependency from my
Hmm.
perspective.
Control,
Like,
control, control.
I am going to attempt to control my like internal world and my level of comfort by bringing someone to where I believe that they need to be for me to be okay. Now, if we
Hmm.
use the example that you just gave of the friend who is perpetually late, I will express to this person, when you're late, it makes me feel
Hmm.
unvalued. It makes me feel all kinds of like discomfort and like I'm wasting my time, whatever the thing is, right? All of those things that I am feeling in those moments, are those about her really? Or are they a story that I am telling myself about where I am placed in her, like, love? It's a little bit of what we were saying before, right? It's like I'm telling myself a story about,
Personalizing it.
yeah, my worth connected to that person's behavior. I would say not only is it arguable, but I don't know that it's true at all. I'm
Hmm.
sure that person, you are not the only person in that person's life that they were perpetually late to meet. And so,
And I know that for a fact.
to my point, yeah, or to your point, I don't know whose point. Um, I think there's a way of saying, given that this is the way this person shows up in the world, and I have seen it repeatedly, I could attempt to modify their behavior. And I would say, good luck with that, right? Like,
Hmm.
what you're going to do is like create like tension and angst or whatever. Or I could say, you know, I am not going to like have dinner with this person or like, whatever. And some people might say, well, that's not communicating. And to your point, you could communicate and say, you're always late. Um,
I'm not going to
and
make
I'm
plans
not
with you
having dinner
anymore.
with you anymore, and that's
Yeah.
my boundary, right? Like, you could do that,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think it comes down to, like, do I value the time with this person? And
Hmm.
if I do, can I maybe modify? Like, I might say, "Okay, I know so and so is always late. That's a little bit their shtick. This is a little bit not for everyone, but this is kinda how I move through the world." I'm going to maybe, when I go meet that person, bring something to work on or
Hmm.
listen to a podcast or do whatever to not be in the story of
Or
like
tell them
upset.
the reservation's at 7 when it's actually at 7:30, which I've done with this
Yes.
person.
I mean, there are ways to like work with that. And
Yeah.
listen, I do that with my kid's dad. Like, he tends to not be on time. So, and he gets very mad at me
Mikey,
when
you're
I
always
do
late.
that.
Damn it.
And again, that's the responsibility I have to take. But I think the larger point to me
Hmm.
is, how do I be in right relationship with myself and what is coming up for me in terms of the angst or the feelings of unworthiness around someone else's behavior? Because there's just a way that I think we are creating too much of a coupling around someone behaves a certain way and that means something about me.
Yep.
And that is my own attachment wound, inner child
Abandonment
stuff for
wounding.
me to go back and clean up for me. And
Hmm.
then I'm able to just let people be who they are in the world without me taking it personally. And y'all, when I tell you, it's like the most liberating thing. Like, everybody gets to be exactly who they are. That doesn't
Yep.
have a damn thing to do with me. Now I can decide, like, I'm not going to go sit and like waste 30 minutes of time. That's your choice. Absolutely. But needing that person to modify their behavior so that you can breathe, that doesn't hurt them. That hurts you.
That's right. Yeah, and full circling it back to what we were saying about why these two are similar. Obviously the personalization, but also like you were saying, it's that fear. It's the way that we try to control other people, control the situation, even control ourselves in order to manipulate circumstances and situations, and that all has to do with that fear of abandonment, that fear of rejection. There's these existential fears that today and I talk about all the time that are really at the heart of the motivation for these controlling behaviors, for these rigid ways of thinking or expecting people to be or
Mm,
act or show up, right? And
that's right.
so that's why you and I was saying it's like you just follow that thread back. Like it's not just about the behavior, what's going on underneath it, right? And so I think we did it. I think we brought it back full circle. I'm very proud of us, by the way, because I think at first glance those two seemed very different. But I hope, I don't know, you guys listening, tell me if I'm wrong, that we were able to bring it back and connect those two seemingly different Q and A's.
If there's one thing about me and V, we're gonna find a way to connect it back to codependency. Like, just know that we'll find a way. It's codependent.
We will find a way. And our friend Todd Barrett's probably cringe when we say that.
I said what I said,
We
Todd. I
love you,
love you.
Todd.
Aw.
All right, you all. Well, be well. Hit us up with any Q&As if you have any. We always have a link open on our bio on Instagram for you to submit them. So send them along, and we will answer them and do our best to tie them and weave them back to codependency.
We promise not to call you codependent.
Well, we don't promise, actually.